the scope of investments that you touch on historically that America's done are a great part of your book. You cite the GI Bill, FHA, the Homestead Act. Morning Joe, you mentioned the superhighway that we built. I mean, could you expound here on the massive investments that you're talking about that historically that we can identify with as Americans?
Well, let me also compare it to other countries, because your question about that, you know, globalization certainly did affect manufacturing jobs, but if you look at other OECD countries, if you look at Europe, Germany, Canada, they also are affected by globalization, but they have been more resilient. And we used to be an incredibly resilient economy. I think we've become less so, a little bit more rigid than those countries. So case in point, if you look at after the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, when auto workers were laid off both in Detroit and in Windsor, or Ontario, Canada, it was an interesting way to compare what happened. So in Detroit, the auto workers were laid off, and because of the extreme circumstances, they were given extra unemployment benefits and cash, a little bit more cash. But they had no health care. So, I mean, they're fretting. Their families are just going nuts about what are we going to do about health care. And so then, if you look at what happened in Windsor, these auto workers were laid off, but first of all, their families still had the health care, so they didn't have to worry about that. Second, Canada does really well with retraining. They have these activity centers, where they kick into action when there are grand layoffs. And so they looked in the area at the employers and saw what the demand for jobs was, and they discovered that it was in nursing. So they put together nursing training programs. So they retrain these auto workers so that they actually can go into nursing. Now, of course, not everybody's going to want to do that, but those who did, they were able to reintegrate back into society much more quickly. And then you don't have, several years later, the kind of entanglement in drugs and alcoholism that we have here in the U.S. So that's one example. The other example, in terms of investment, you say, in these large programs, yes, we did have investments in the GI Bill. And, for instance, out in Oregon, and I'm sure, and also in many places, I mean, everybody talks about the pioneering spirit. Here in America, in Texas, everyone has the pioneering spirit, right? Well, we always forget to say that there's this thing called the Homestead Act that allowed people to migrate to other areas, and if you just sat yourself down, you'd get 640 acres. Well, that's a nice incentive there. That really isn't mentioned when you say I had the pioneering spirit to go out and find a place in Oregon. So investment is really important. I want to talk a little bit very quickly about the UK and how it was very successful in tackling child poverty. So Tony Blair said, we're just going to tackle child poverty. More than 1 in 4 kids in the UK in 1999 were considered poor. That was slightly more than in the US. So they had a big problem with child poverty. Over 10 years of all sorts of programs, from literacy programs, child tax credits, child allowances, better maternity leave, paid maternity leave extended to 9 months for mothers, all sorts of other programs, nurse visitation programs, all the things that all the researchers say that you should do to improve child poverty, they did it. And they cut the number of children in poverty by half. So it is doable. It did cost quite a bit of money. It was the equivalent of $130 billion, but we can afford that.
Nick, you want to talk about our broad history of these big investments?
Yeah, I mean, it's striking. In Oregon, our area was transformed by the combination of public legislation and private initiatives. So the Homestead Acts they laid the basis for Oregon. Then rural electrification was critical to the farming communities. The GI Bill of Rights allowed people to get an education and to build and to get homes. And likewise, we tend to forget that the US was really the country that invented mass education. So Europe had great elite education. And so if you went to Eton and then Oxford, you probably had just about the best education in the world. But if you were an ordinary kid somewhere in the US, you went to a okay elementary school, and you were much more likely to go to high school than a British or French kid. And later, so the U.S. pioneered mass secondary education, then pioneered mass tertiary education, and both community colleges and public colleges, which initially were kind of free. And one example of the impact of that, we write about a girl called Mary Daly who grew up in Missouri and was a bright kid, but her dad worked for the post office. He was fired. That caused strains in the marriage. The parents divorced. And Mary, at age 15, dropped out of high school. She worked in a donut shop. Then a local college teacher called Betsy Bain heard about this, heard there was this bright kid who had dropped out at 15, and told Mary Daly to take the GED, at least get a GED. So Mary took the GED. She did very, very well on it. And then Betsy Bain said, look, you should, take some classes at the local college. It's almost free. And Mary said, I can't afford that. Betsy Bain said, look, I'll pay your first semester. Mary Daly went, was a brilliant student. After the first semester, she got scholarships, earned her BA, her master's, her PhD, got a job, became an economist, joined the San Francisco Fed, and is now president of the San Francisco Fed, focusing on inequality. Now, obviously, that's a benefit for Mary Daly, but it's also a benefit for the country. And when you have people who can live up to their talents, then that's kind of a basic condition for a country living up to its potential as well.
So pay attention to all those people working in donut shops.
Yeah.